The porch light was on when I pulled into the driveway, which should have felt like a welcome. It didn't. I was 32 years old, sitting in the passenger seat of a transport van arranged by the rehabilitation center in Roanoke, my left leg in a stabilizing brace and a discharge folder on my lap that contained 6 months of medical history, 2 follow-up appointment cards, and a single printed sheet titled Reentry Support Resources that someone had included with apparent optimism. The driver, a quiet man named Dale who had not asked a single personal question during the 2-hour drive, for which I was genuinely grateful, pulled up to the curb and waited while I gathered myself. The house looked exactly as it always had. White clapboard, green shutters, the hydrangea my mother Diane had planted along the front walk when I was 12, now overgrown and winter bare. The same house I had grown up in, left at 22 for paramedic training in Bristol, and returned to only for holidays and the occasional weekend in the years since. I had spent the last decade building a life calibrated to emergency, to the particular focus of search and rescue work in mountain terrain, to the physical precision that work required, to the identity of someone whose body was a reliable instrument. The accident had taken that identity with the same speed and indifference as everything else it had taken. A collapsed trail structure in the Jefferson National Forest, a patient I had been stabilizing, a secondary failure in the rigging nobody had anticipated. I had shielded the patient instinctively. That part one remembered clearly, the decision arriving before thought. What came after was reconstructed from other people's accounts. The fall, the impact, the fractures in my left tibia and fibula, the nerve damage in my lower leg that the orthopedic surgeon had described with careful precision as significant and permanent in its current presentation, though the full picture would clarify over time. The patient had walked out. I had not. Dale helped me with my bag without making it feel like help, which was a skill I had not previously thought to appreciate. I thanked him. He nodded and drove away, and I stood on the front path in the November cold with my crutches and my discharge folder, and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been institutional for 6 months, and is now standing in front of something that is supposed to be the opposite of that. The door opened before I reached it. My mother appeared in the frame, 58, compact, with the brisk energy she wore like a coat in all weather. She looked at my leg, then at my face, then said, "You look thin." Not, "I'm glad you're home." Not, "How are you?" Just the observation, delivered with the particular efficiency of a woman who processed most things as problems requiring assessment. "Long drive," I said. She held the door and I maneuvered through it, and immediately understood that something in the house had rearranged itself in the months I'd been away. My old bedroom was down the hall on the left. I knew this. But when I reached it and pushed the door open, I found not my room but a combined storage and craft space. Shelves of fabric and seasonal decorations, a folding table with a sewing machine, my old furniture pushed to the walls and covered with boxes. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Something moved through me that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was the feeling of a door that had been quietly closed while you were away, and you only discover it when you try to open it. "I figured the couch would be easier for your leg," my mother said from behind me. "Getting in and out of bed with that brace." The couch in the living room had a pull-out. This was practical. She was not wrong about the logistics. I understood all of that while also understanding something else, something I didn't yet have the language to name fully, that the room had been converted not because of my leg but because the space had been available and availability had been assumed. My brother Kellen arrived for dinner that evening. He was 35, worked in equipment sales in Johnson City, and had a quality I had spent years admiring before I understood it as something else. He always knew which way the wind was blowing, and he positioned himself accordingly. He hugged me with the brief firmness of someone completing an obligation and sat down at the table, and talked to my mother for most of the meal while I ate quietly on the pull-out end of the couch with my leg elevated on a pillow. Neither of them asked about the accident. Not the details, not what had happened on the mountain, not what the 6 months in rehabilitation had been. They asked about the food at the center, was it decent, could I eat normally, and about whether Dale had been a good driver and whether I needed anything from the pharmacy. I answered everything. I watched the candles my mother had lit for the occasion burn down incrementally and thought about a thing I could not quite reach yet, something just below the surface of the evening. Across the ridge, visible from the kitchen window if you stood at the right angle, were the lights of my grandfather Amos's farmhouse. He had not come to dinner. He had called me twice while I was in the rehabilitation center. Real calls, long ones asking real questions, and had said only that he'd see me when I was ready and that the bees had had a good summer. That night, lying on the pull-out couch in the living room with the brace loosened and the house quiet around me, I thought about those calls. About the specific quality of being asked real questions. About how rare it had apparently become. I was home. But I was not. I was beginning to understand, in a place that had been waiting for me. The first 2 weeks had the texture of a long waiting room. I occupied the pull-out couch, managed my physical therapy exercises each morning on the living room floor with the instructional sheet from the rehab center propped against the coffee table, and moved through the house with the careful awareness of someone who is a guest in a space that used to belong to them. My mother worked mornings at the dental office on Main Street, where she had been a receptionist for 19 years. Kellen came by 3 or 4 evenings a week for dinner, always unannounced, always staying for 2 hours and leaving without having addressed anything of substance. The physical therapy was hard in a way that required privacy to be honest about. My left leg had been rebuilt with hardware, 2 plates, 7 screws, and the nerve damage below the knee meant that certain sensations had been replaced by a combination of numbness and unexpected sharp signals that the neurologist had called reorganization. Walking with the crutches was manageable. Walking without them, which was the goal, was a daily negotiation with a body that no longer behaved according to its previous agreements. I did not complain about this in the house. I had learned, somewhere in childhood, that my mother processed pain as inconvenience, not without sympathy, but with a brisk efficiency that moved quickly past the feeling toward the practical question of what was being done about it. I had internalized that processing style so thoroughly that I sometimes caught myself doing it to myself. On the 4th day I walked to Amos's. It took 30 minutes on the crutches, down the back path through the tree line that connected the 2 properties, a path I had known since I was small, worn smooth by decades of use. The November air was cold and clean and smelled of wood smoke and creek water, and by the time I reached the edge of his meadow I was tired in a way that felt honest rather than defeating. He was in the barn when I arrived, doing something with frames and wire. 77 years old, lean as a fence post, with hands that had the specific quality of hands that had worked their whole life, knuckled and precise, missing the tip of one finger from an incident he described differently every time. He looked up when I came through the door and studied me for a moment with the particular attention of someone who is making an actual assessment rather than a social one. "Sit down," he said. He pulled a stool from the wall and set it near the workbench without ceremony. I sat. He went back to the frames. We didn't speak for a few minutes, which with Amos was not silence in the uncomfortable sense but silence in the working sense, the kind that exists between people who don't need to fill space. Then he said, "How bad is the leg, really?" I told him. All of it, the fractures, the hardware, the nerve damage, the prognosis that was phrased carefully enough that I had spent several nights working out what it actually meant. He listened without interruption, without the quick pivot to practicality, without the expression I had become accustomed to in the rehabilitation center of medical professionals managing my emotional response. When I finished, he said, "That's a significant thing to carry." 3 words that were not advice, not reframing, not a plan, just acknowledgement. I had not realized until that moment how much I had been missing it. Back at the house that evening, my mother noticed I had been out. She asked where. When I said Amos's, she made a small sound, not disapproval exactly, but something adjacent, the sound of a woman who had her own complicated relationship with her father-in-law and had learned to express it through small noises rather than direct statements. I filed that sound away without examining it. That was a mistake, as I would understand later. The days developed a rhythm. Mornings of physical therapy, afternoons on the couch with my laptop doing the administrative work of being injured, insurance forms, correspondence with my employer about the workers' compensation claim, follow-up emails to the medical team in Roanoke. Evenings of dinner with my mother, occasionally Kellen, the television on at a volume that precluded the kind of conversation I would have needed to have if I were going to say anything true. My friend Petra called weekly. We had met during paramedic training in Bristol a decade earlier and stayed close through the years of different postings and occasional overlapping shifts. She knew the accident in detail, had been one of the first people I'd called from the hospital, and her calls in the rehabilitation center had been a genuine lifeline. She called now with the same consistency, asking real questions about the leg, about the therapy, about what came next. "How's being home?" she asked about 10 days in. "Strange," I said. "Strange how?" I hesitated. I was in the hallway, speaking quietly because my mother was in the next room. Like I'm visiting, I said. Petra was quiet for a moment. Is that new, or has it always been like that? The question arrived cleanly and stayed. I didn't answer it fully that night. But it lodged somewhere and continued working. 3 weeks after I came home, Kellen asked about the workers' compensation settlement. We were on the back porch after dinner. Him with a beer, me with tea, the December dark coming on hard and cold over the ridge. He had been building toward it for several minutes through a conversation about his work, about tight margins, about a truck payment that had gotten away from him. I had listened without tracking it as preamble. I should have. The settlement, he said, with the particular casualness of someone who has rehearsed the casualness. You have any idea of the timeline? Processing, I said. Could be months. But significant, right? Given the permanence of the injury. I looked at him. The porch light caught the side of his face and he was looking at the yard. Not at me, with the studied neutrality of a man who has calculated the risk of direct eye contact. It's compensation for a permanent disability, I said. Yes. Right. He took a drink. Mom was thinking, and I think it makes sense that if you're going to be here for a while, it might be fair to contribute to the house. The utilities have gone up. She's on a fixed income basically. Something inside me went very still. I had been in this house for 3 weeks. I was sleeping on a pull-out couch because my bedroom had been converted. I was managing a serious injury with daily physical therapy. The workers' compensation claim, money that existed specifically because my body had been permanently altered in the course of my work, was being factored into a household budget conversation as though it were a windfall rather than a loss. How long has this been the plan? I asked. It's not a plan, he said. It's just you're here, and it costs money to run a house. I said I'd think about it, which was what I said when I needed to end a conversation without escalating it. He nodded and finished his beer and left 20 minutes later, and I sat on the porch alone in the cold for a long time afterward. Looking back, I had been seeing the signals for weeks without naming them. The converted bedroom. Not a temporary measure but a statement of expectation. The way my mother mentioned the utility bills in passing twice. The way Kellen had started asking about my plans, with a frequency that had felt like concern and now felt like something more calculated. None of it had been subtle. I had simply been too disoriented by the injury, by the return, by the effort of daily physical recovery, to assemble the pieces into the picture they formed. The next morning, I walked to Amos's earlier than usual. He was already outside, winterizing one of the hive stands in the far corner of the meadow. I came across the field and stood beside him without speaking for a moment, watching his hands move with their characteristic slowness, and then I told him what Kellen had said. He didn't look up from the work. Did that surprise you? He asked. I thought about it honestly. No, I said. That's what surprises me. He was quiet for a moment. Then, your mother asked me for money last spring. Said the furnace needed replacing. He paused. The furnace was fine. I absorbed this. The picture was assembling itself with the particular clarity of something that had always been true but required distance to see. My mother's finances were under pressure. Kellen knew, had always known, was probably helping manage it. My presence, my injury, my incoming settlement were not an inconvenience to be accommodated. They were a resource that had been identified before I arrived. I had been positioned, without being consulted, as a solution to a problem I hadn't known existed. The cold was sharp across the meadow. One of the hives hummed faintly even in December. The colony clustered inside, generating its own warmth through collective motion. I watched it and felt something clarify inside me that had been murky for weeks. That afternoon I called the workers' compensation adjuster and asked about direct deposit options. I called a property management office in Abingdon about available rentals. I did both of these things quietly from the back porch with my phone turned away from the kitchen window. I didn't tell Petra everything yet. But when she called that Thursday I was more honest than I had been, and she asked fewer reframing questions and listened more, and at the end she said, "Whatever you decide, you're not wrong for deciding it." That was the first time anyone had said something like that to me since the accident. It landed somewhere deep and stayed. Amos had kept bees for 38 years. He had started the year his wife, my grandmother Ruth, who died when I was 4, had her first serious illness. He told me this on a morning in late December when we were together in his workroom, him repairing frames with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that certain tasks reward slowness, me doing what I could with my right hand while the left leg rested on a second stool. He said he had needed something that required his full attention, something that would fail if he looked away. I had heard this before, in other forms, from other people talking about the things that kept them functional during the worst periods of their lives. But hearing it from Amos in that specific workroom on that specific morning, it arrived differently, as information about what I might need rather than as a story about what he had needed. "Can I help with the hives?" I asked. He looked at me. Not at my leg, at my face. "How much can you do?" "More than I could 3 weeks ago," I said. "Less than I'll be able to do in 3 months." He nodded. "Come Thursday," he said. Thursday became a fixed point in my week. We worked the hives together, or rather, he worked them and I observed and assisted where I could, learning the particular grammar of the apiary, how to read a frame, how to assess colony health, how to move slowly and deliberately because the bees responded to the quality of your attention and not just your physical proximity. The crutches were awkward at first. Amos modified the approach path to 2 of the hives without comment, clearing a smoother route through the frozen grass. The work required something that nothing in the previous 2 months had required: complete presence. You could not think about settlement timelines or pull out couches or Kellen's carefully casual questions while standing at an open hive. The bees did not permit distraction. They responded to stillness, to steadiness, to the particular calm of someone who had brought their whole self to the task. Learning to provide that, with a damaged leg, with a body still reorganizing itself, was the hardest and most necessary thing I had done since the accident. My left leg ached consistently through December and into January. The nerve signals were unpredictable. Some days almost normal, others a combination of numbness and sharp interruption that made me catch my breath. I reported all of this faithfully at my follow-up appointments in Roanoke, and the orthopedic team noted it, and the physical therapist adjusted my exercises accordingly and slowly, incrementally, in the way that recovery moves, which is not linearly but in a forward direction overall, things improved. Petra came to visit in January, driving up from Bristol on a Saturday. We sat in Amos's kitchen because I had taken to spending most of my non-medical time there. And she met him and watched us work a hive together in the cold afternoon light, and afterward over coffee she said, "You seem more like yourself than you did 6 months ago." "I feel more like myself," I said. "Somewhere other than the house." She looked at me steadily. "Sera," she said, "what's actually going on with the house?" I told her everything then: the bedroom, the settlement conversation, Amos's information about the furnace and my mother's finances, the rental inquiry I had quietly made. She listened without reframing any of it. At the end she said, "When are you moving?" "I signed a lease last week," I said. "February 1st. She put her coffee down and looked at me, and her expression was the expression of someone who has been waiting for you to make a decision, and is genuinely relieved you made it. "Good," she said. Simply, "Good." I told my mother on a Sunday evening in late January. I chose Sunday deliberately. Not a dinner, not with Kellen present, not with the television on. Just the 2 of us at the kitchen table with tea, the winter dark outside the window, the house quiet in the specific way it went quiet when it was only the 2 of us and there was nothing to perform for. I said I had found a place in town. A ground floor apartment on Green Spring Road, accessible with a small yard that faced south. I was moving on February 1st. She looked at me for a long moment. Her expression moved through several things: surprise, then something that was not quite hurt but was its container, then the brisk resettlement into practicality that was her default register for difficult emotions. "That's very soon," she said. "I've had a few weeks to plan it," I said. She wrapped her hands around her mug. "I thought you'd be here longer. While you were still recovering." "I'll still be recovering in the apartment," I said. "The location doesn't change the recovery." She was quiet. Then, "Kellen mentioned the finances." "I know what Kellen mentioned," I said. My voice stayed even. I had prepared for this part. "Mom, I need to say something, and I'd like you to hear it before you respond." She looked at me. "I came home injured because I needed to recover somewhere, and this was home. But I've been sleeping on a pull-out couch because my room was converted while I was in the hospital. The settlement that's coming, that's compensation for a permanent disability. It exists because my leg will never be fully what it was. Using it to offset household expenses isn't something I'm able to do. The kitchen was very still. I didn't convert the room to hurt you, she said quietly. I know, I said. I don't think any of it was meant to hurt me. I think it was practical, and I think I was expected to absorb the practical decisions the same way I've always absorbed them. And I have absorbed a lot of them over a long time without saying anything. I'm saying something now. Her jaw tightened in the way I had watched since childhood, the physical sign of emotion being compressed into a manageable form. You've been talking to Amos, she said. It was not quite an accusation. Yes, I said. He's always had his own ideas about this family. He answered my questions honestly, I said. That's what I needed. We sat with the space between us for a while. She didn't apologize, not clearly, not in the form I had needed. She said she hadn't realized how things had looked from my side, which was different from acknowledging how things had been. She said she'd had a hard year financially, which was true and was also not the point. She said she just wanted the family to be okay. I told her I wanted that too. I told her that wanting it didn't require me to stay on the pull-out couch. When I left that evening and drove back along the dark road toward town, I felt the specific exhaustion of a conversation that had said what needed saying without resolving into the clean shape you hoped for. But underneath the exhaustion was something solid, something that had not been there before. I had said the true thing, in the room where it needed to be said. That was enough for now. I moved on a Tuesday in February. Amos helped. He drove his truck and carried boxes with the unhurried deliberateness of a man for whom physical effort has never been performance. Petra drove up from Bristol and arrived at 9 in the morning with coffee and spent the day assembling furniture and hanging curtains and making the apartment feel, by evening, like a place that had been lived in by someone with intentions. The apartment was small and south-facing and full of winter light. The yard was narrow but long, with a wooden fence along the back and a stretch of bare ground that would, by April, be something workable. I had already talked to Amos about 2 starter hives. He had already begun preparing the equipment. The workers' compensation settlement came through in March. I put the majority of it in a savings account. I used a portion to cover 3 months of rent in advance and to purchase the beekeeping equipment. I did not contribute to the household on Green Spring Road because it was my household now, and contributing to it meant contributing to something I had built. My leg continued its slow reorganization. By March I was using 1 crutch instead of 2, and by April I had days when I walked without either for short distances. The nerve signals were less chaotic, still present, still unpredictable, but no longer the constant foreground noise they had been in November. The physical therapist in Roanoke said I was ahead of the projected timeline. I thought about what had changed between November and April, and the answer included the apartment and the hives and the particular quality of Amos's attention, and the fact that I had stopped spending energy on absorbing things that should not have been mine to absorb. My mother and I found a new arrangement. Not repaired, rearranged. I drove to the house on alternate Sundays by choice, when I wanted to rather than because the week's architecture required it. The dinners were shorter and, in some ways, more genuine, less performance, less managed warmth. She did not mention the settlement again. Kellen texted occasionally about nothing consequential, and I answered with equivalent nothing, and the distance that had always existed between us simply became acknowledged rather than papered over. Amos came to the apartment every Thursday. We worked the hives together in the yard. 2 colonies by May, both established, the bees orienting to the south-facing fence line with the committed purposefulness that I had come to find genuinely steadying. He taught me to read the frames with the confidence of accumulated knowledge rather than anxiety, to trust what I was seeing, to act on accurate assessment rather than hope. I understood somewhere in that spring that this was what the bees had been teaching me since November. Not beekeeping, the practice of trusting my own perceptions, of staying present with what was actually in front of me rather than with the version of it I had been offered by other people. I had been very good, for a very long time, at receiving other people's interpretations of my own experience and calling that perspective. What I had been doing with Amos frame by frame, hive by hive, was learning to look directly and call what I saw by its actual name. Petra came for a weekend in June. We sat in the yard in the long evening light with the hives humming 20 feet away, and the smell of honeysuckle coming over the fence, and she said, "You seem like someone who lives here." "I do live here," I said. "That's what I mean," she said. I thought about the porch light in November, how it should have felt like a welcome and didn't. I thought about the converted room, the pull-out couch, the green beans going cold at Kellen's calculated dinner table. I thought about all the energy I had spent in those first weeks trying to find the version of events that asked the least of the people around me and the most of myself. I had been very good at that. I was becoming better at something else. The bees moved between the hive boxes and the honeysuckle with their characteristic indifference to everything that wasn't the work. 2 colonies, 12 frames each, a yard full of June light. Small things. Enough. What Sera's story reveals most clearly is how injury changes the terms of every relationship it touches, and how the people closest to us reveal themselves most honestly not in the crisis itself, but in the quiet weeks that follow. The accident in the Jefferson National Forest was a single violent event. What followed was slower and in its own way more damaging. The return to a house that had reorganized itself around her absence, the bedroom converted with pragmatic speed, the settlement identified as a resource before she had finished her first week on the pull-out couch. None of these were dramatic acts of cruelty. Each was a small decision made by people who had calculated that Sera would absorb it, as she had absorbed small decisions her whole life, and say nothing. That calculation was correct for 3 weeks. Then it stopped being correct. Not because Sera became a different person, but because the injury had stripped away the particular kind of busyness that had previously allowed her to avoid seeing the pattern clearly. Search and rescue work had kept her physically and psychologically calibrated to emergency, always moving forward, always oriented toward the next deployment. Returning injured, immobile, dependent, it removed the motion that had functioned as avoidance, and left her sitting still in a house that had never fully been waiting for her. Kellen's conversation about the settlement was the moment the architecture became visible all at once. Not because it was unprecedented. Amos's account of the furnace money established that the pattern long predated Sera's return, but because it was the first time the calculation had been stated out loud in her presence. The money that existed because her body had been permanently altered was being factored into a household budget, as though the alteration were incidental. That reframing of loss as resource was the clearest expression of how her family had always related to her. As someone whose capacity existed to be utilized, whose well-being was secondary to the household's functional needs. What makes the Amos relationship so structurally important is that it operated on entirely different terms. He asked real questions. He waited for real answers. He modified the approach path to the hives without comment, without making her feel like a problem to be accommodated. The contrast between his attention and her family's management of her was not lost on Sera, but she needed weeks of both side by side, before the difference became something she could articulate and act on. The beekeeping itself worked on her in the way that sustained physical attention always works on psychological damage. By requiring presence, it gradually rebuilt the capacity for it. Sera had spent her career being physically present in emergencies, while managing her emotional experience of her family from a safe distance. The hives collapsed that distance. You cannot be elsewhere while standing at an open colony. That enforced presence, practiced daily, in a context that responded honestly to the quality of her attention, was what ultimately allowed her to sit at her mother's kitchen table and say the true thing without flinching from the response. What I find most quietly devastating in this story is not the converted bedroom or the settlement conversation. It's the fact that Sera had to be injured to finally stop moving long enough to see what had always been there. She had spent a decade in a career that kept her in motion, always deployed, always purposeful. And that motion had been, among other things, a way of not being home. Not consciously, but effectively. The accident ended that. And in ending it, forced a reckoning that the previous 10 years of careful distance had postponed. I think a lot of us do this, build lives that keep us usefully busy in the right direction, away from the things we haven't yet found the words for. The question is what it takes to finally stop and look.